The air on the Skarn flagship felt heavier than any air I had ever breathed. I stood in the center of a circular chamber built from black metal that seemed to drink the light around it, surrounded by armed guards twice my height, their eyes glowing faint violet under helmets shaped like curved horns. My hands were folded behind my back, the way Ambassador Grace Whitfield had trained me to stand, calm, still, unreadable. But my heart was pounding so hard, I was sure the translator device clipped to my collar could hear it. Queen Veiltharis sat above us on a throne carved from a single piece of dark crystal, watching the small human delegation the way a child might watch an insect trapped in a jar. Every sentence dripped with amusement, like our presence was a joke she was still waiting for the punchline to. "So this is the great human delegation," she said, her voice echoing through hidden speakers built into the chamber walls. "3 of you. No weapons. No fleet waiting outside my window. Tell me, little creatures, did your leaders simply run out of anyone more important to send?" Grace stood beside me, her jaw tight, but her voice steady. "We were sent because we believe in diplomacy first, Your Majesty. Humanity does not need to posture to prove its strength." The Queen laughed, and around the chamber, dozens of Skarn nobles laughed with her, a wave of mockery that rolled through the room like a cold wind. I felt my face burn, but I said nothing. This was not the time. We were here because of the Dencora mining dispute, a conflict that had already cost lives on both sides, human colonists and Skarn settlers clashing over resources on a moon neither species had any real claim to. If this summit failed, the fragile peace between our two peoples would collapse into something far worse. I was only an attaché, a translator, a nobody in the grand structure of interstellar politics, but I had studied Skarn customs for 6 years, and Grace needed someone in the room who understood the subtext behind every insult the Queen threw at us. "Let us discuss the terms," Grace said, stepping forward and placing a small data crystal on the table between us. "Humanity is prepared to offer joint access to the mineral fields, split evenly, with independent oversight from a neutral Concord Council." The Queen did not even look at the crystal. Instead, her eyes drifted lazily across the 3 of us, lingering with obvious disdain. "You want equal access, as if a species that only reached the stars a century ago deserves to sit at the same table as an empire that has ruled 100 worlds for 10,000 years. Beside me, Oliver Bennett, the youngest member of our delegation, shifted his weight nervously. I placed a hand briefly on his arm, a silent reminder to stay calm. The Skarn respected control above almost everything else. Losing composure here would be worse than losing the negotiation itself. 10,000 years of rule, Grace answered carefully, and yet here we are, forced to negotiate as equals over a single moon. Perhaps that says something about how strength alone does not always win. A ripple of tension moved through the nobles. The Queen's smile faded for just a moment, replaced by something sharper, colder. Then it returned, wider than before, as if she had decided we were more entertaining than she expected. "You have spirit, human," she said. "I will give you that. But spirit will not save your colonists when my fleet arrives at Dencora in 3 days, if this dispute is not settled to my satisfaction." The room went quiet. Even the guards seemed to hold their breath. 3 days. That was new information, something Grace had clearly not expected either, based on the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "You did not mention a fleet deployment before this summit began," Grace said. "I did not think I needed to remind you of the obvious," the Queen replied. "Every conversation happens under the shadow of consequence. That is simply how diplomacy works among civilized species. Perhaps your kind has not learned that yet." I felt anger rising in my chest, quick and hot, but I forced it down. This was exactly the reaction she wanted. The Skarn believed humans were emotional, impulsive, easy to provoke into mistakes. Every insult was a test, and failing it would give her exactly the excuse she seemed to be looking for. "We understand consequence perfectly well, Your Majesty," I said, speaking for the first time since we entered the chamber. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "We simply prefer to build agreements that last, rather than threats that only delay the next conflict. The Queen's attention shifted to me fully for the first time, her violet eyes narrowing slightly. The translator speaks. How refreshing. Most of your kind stay silent unless spoken to directly, like well-trained animals. I did not respond to the insult. I had learned long ago that silence could be its own kind of answer, and that giving her a reaction now would only confirm every assumption she already held about us. She studied me a moment longer, then waved a clawed hand dismissively, as if bored of the exchange already. Bring forward your formal terms, then, since you seem so eager to prove your civilization deserves respect. Grace nodded to me, and I stepped closer to the table to arrange the documents we had prepared, laying them out in the order the Skarn preferred for formal review. Oldest agreements first, newest proposals last. It was a small detail, but details mattered here. Every gesture in this chamber was being measured, weighed, judged against 1,000 years of ceremony none of us fully understood. As I reached across the table to align the final page, my sleeve slipped back slightly, exposing my wrist and the plain silver ring I always wore on my right hand. I barely thought about it. The ring had been on my hand every single day since my grandmother passed it to me years ago, a simple band with a faint engraving worn smooth by time. Nothing special to look at, nothing that had ever drawn attention from anyone, human or otherwise. I straightened the last document, tapped the edge of the table twice out of habit, the way I always did when I finished organizing paperwork, and stepped back into position beside Grace. I did not notice the sudden silence at first. It was Oliver who nudged me, his eyes wide, staring past me toward the throne. Queen Vaeltharis was no longer smiling. Her posture had changed entirely, the lazy, amused slouch replaced by something rigid and alert. Her eyes were locked on my hand, on the ring still resting against the edge of the table where I had tapped it moments before. The nobles around her had gone completely silent, and several of the guards nearest to us had shifted their stance, hands moving slightly toward weapons at their sides, though none of them had drawn anything yet. I froze, uncertain what I had done wrong. Had I broken some unspoken rule of formality? Had my tapping the table been seen as disrespectful? I ran through every lesson I had studied about Skarn etiquette, searching desperately for some forgotten rule I might have violated without realizing it, but nothing came to mind. This felt different from an ordinary breach of manners. This felt like something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with etiquette at all. Your Majesty, Grace began carefully, clearly sensing the shift in the room as well. Is something wrong? The Queen did not answer immediately. She rose from her throne, slowly, deliberately, her long robes trailing behind her as she descended the short steps toward the table where we stood. The guards parted to let her through without being ordered to, something I had not seen happen once since we arrived. Even the two officials standing closest to the throne stepped backward, as though giving her a wide berth for whatever was about to happen. She stopped directly across from me, close enough now that I could see fine details in her face I had missed from a distance, thin lines around her eyes that might have been age, or worry, or something else entirely. Her gaze was fixed entirely on my right hand. "Show me your hand," she said quietly. Her voice had lost every trace of mockery. It was flat now, controlled, careful, the tone of someone forcing themselves to remain composed despite something deeply unsettling happening in front of them. I hesitated, glancing at Grace, who gave me a small, uncertain nod. Slowly, I raised my hand and held it out across the table, palm down, the plain silver ring catching the dim light of the chamber. The Queen leaned forward, studying it with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a long moment, nobody in the chamber moved or spoke. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and somewhere behind me, Oliver's breathing had gone shallow and quick. Then she looked up at me, and for the first time since we had arrived on her ship, I saw something in her expression that was not amusement, was not contempt, was not the practiced boredom of a monarch entertaining lesser beings. It was fear. "Where did you get that?" she asked, and her voice shook, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. just enough to tell me that whatever was happening in this chamber had shifted into something none of us in the human delegation had walked in prepared for. The chamber remained silent for what felt like an entire minute, though it could not have been more than a few seconds. I stood there with my hand still extended across the table, the ring catching faint reflections from the crystal walls, and I had absolutely no idea why a monarch who ruled 100 worlds looked as though she had just seen something impossible standing in front of her. My mind raced through every possibility, wondering if I had somehow stolen an heirloom without knowing it, wondering if the ring resembled some forbidden symbol from Scarn history, wondering 100 small frightened things that made no sense given what little I actually knew. It was my grandmother's, I said finally, because it was the only true answer I had. She gave it to me before she passed. It has been in my family for a long time. The Queen's eyes never left the ring. "How long," she asked, "is a long time, by your reckoning?" I glanced at Grace, who looked just as confused as I felt, though she was doing a much better job of hiding it behind her diplomatic composure. "I do not know exactly," I admitted. "My grandmother told me it belonged to her mother, and her mother before that. She said it went back further than anyone in our family could remember clearly. I always assumed it was simply an old family heirloom, nothing more." A murmur spread through the gathered nobles, low and urgent, spoken in a dialect too fast and too quiet for my translator to fully capture. I caught fragments, a word that might have meant seal, another that might have meant oath, but nothing complete enough to understand. Beside the throne, an elderly official pressed both hands over his mouth, as though physically restraining himself from speaking aloud. Queen Valtharis raised one hand sharply, and the murmuring stopped instantly, as if an invisible switch had been thrown across the entire chamber. She straightened, composing herself, though I noticed her hand trembled slightly as she lowered it back to her side, a small crack in the armor of absolute authority she had worn since the moment we boarded her ship. "You truly do not know what that is," she said, and it was not really a question. "I know it is a ring my grandmother wore every day of her life," I said carefully. "I know she told me never to lose it, never to sell it, and never to explain where it came from to anyone who asked. I never understood why. It always seemed like an ordinary piece of jewelry to me." The word ordinary seemed to strike the Queen like a physical blow. She stepped back from the table, putting distance between herself and my outstretched hand, as though suddenly uncertain how close she wanted to be to something she had only ever read about in ancient records passed down through generations of careful custodians. For a moment, I let my mind drift, unable to stop myself, back to evenings spent in my grandmother's small kitchen when I was still a boy, the smell of bread baking, the sound of an old radio playing music from decades before I was born. She would sit across from me at that worn wooden table, turning the ring slowly on her finger, while she told stories that never quite added up, stories about a family that had crossed oceans and continents and, she sometimes hinted with a strange faraway look in her eyes, things far larger than oceans. I remembered asking her once, when I was maybe 10 years old, why the ring never came off, not even to wash dishes, not even to sleep. She had looked at me for a long moment, her expression suddenly serious, in a way that frightened me slightly, and told me that some things are given to a family not because they are pretty, but because someone, somewhere, trusted that family to keep a promise. I had not understood what she meant then, standing in this chamber now, surrounded by beings who clearly understood the ring's significance far better than I ever had. Her words finally began to make a terrible kind of sense. "General Cale Thorne," the Queen said sharply, without turning her head, snapping me back to the present moment. A tall Scarn officer near the edge of the chamber stepped forward immediately, his armor darker and more heavily marked than the palace guards surrounding us, etched with symbols that looked older and more worn than anything else in the room. He bowed low before the Queen, then followed her gaze toward my hand. His reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His entire posture stiffened, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face that looked very much like alarm, quickly masked by the disciplined blankness of a career soldier. "Confirm it," the Queen said quietly. The general approached the table slowly, moving with the careful respect one might show towards something dangerous, rather than something valuable, the way a person might approach a live wire they were not entirely certain was disconnected. He leaned down, studying the ring from several angles without ever attempting to touch it, then straightened and looked at the Queen with an expression I could not quite read. "It matches the old records, Your Majesty," he said. "The engraving pattern, the metal composition indicators along the inner band, the wear marks consistent with an object of significant age. I would need proper instruments to be certain beyond doubt, but based on visual inspection alone, I believe it is authentic." "Authentic," Grace repeated carefully, stepping slightly closer to me, her hand brushing lightly against my elbow in a small gesture meant to steady us both. "Authentic to what, exactly? I think it is time someone explained what is happening here, Your Majesty. My colleague came to this summit as a translator, nothing more. If there is some misunderstanding about a piece of family jewelry, I am sure it can be clarified quickly." One of the younger guards near the wall shifted his weight and reached instinctively toward the sidearm at his belt, as if some old instinct told him the safest response to an unexplained mystery was force. General Thorne caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and gave a single sharp shake of his head, and the guard's hand fell still immediately. It was a small moment, easy to miss, but it told me everything I needed to know about how seriously the people in this room were taking whatever they believed my ring represented. The Queen looked at Grace for a long moment, then back at me, and something in her expression shifted again, though this time it was harder to define, somewhere between calculation and genuine uncertainty. "You truly sent your best translator into this room wearing that, and none of you understood what it meant," she said slowly. "That is either the most reckless diplomatic maneuver I have witnessed in 1,000 years of my reign, or your species has forgotten something far more important than any of us realized." "Forgotten what?" I asked, unable to stop myself. "Your Majesty, please, I do not understand what is happening. This is just a ring my grandmother gave me." She studied me for a long moment, and for the first time since we had entered the chamber, I saw genuine hesitation cross her face, the look of someone weighing how much truth to reveal, and how much danger that truth might carry with it, not only for us, but for herself, and for the empire she ruled. "Clear the chamber," she said finally, turning to address the nobles gathered around the throne. "Everyone except the delegation, General Thorne, and Chancellor Drassen, now." The nobles exchanged uneasy glances, but obeyed immediately, filing out through the tall doors at the rear of the chamber in silence, several of them casting final wide-eyed glances back toward my hand before the heavy doors sealed shut behind them. Within minutes, the vast circular room that had been filled with dozens of watching eyes held only 7 of us: myself, Grace, Oliver, the Queen, General Thorne, an older Scarn official I assumed was Chancellor Drassen, and a handful of personal guards who remained near the doors, standing at rigid attention as though bracing themselves for whatever might happen next. Once the last of the nobles had left, and the heavy doors sealed shut with a low mechanical hum that echoed through the sudden quiet, Queen Valefaris returned to stand before the table, though she no longer carried herself with the same distant superiority she had shown at the start of the summit. Something had changed in her, something that made her seem, for the first time, almost uncertain of her own authority, as though the ground beneath her throne had shifted without warning. "What I am about to tell you," she said quietly, "very few beings outside my own inner court have heard in living memory. I ask that you listen carefully, because it concerns your species far more than mine." Grace nodded slowly. "We are listening, Your Majesty." The Queen glanced once more at my hand, at the plain silver ring resting there as though it weighed nothing at all, though clearly it carried a weight none of us in the room had understood until this very moment. "Long before my empire existed," she began, "long before the Scarn people ever left our home system, there was a war that reshaped the entire region of space your species now calls home. It was fought between powers so old that most records of it have crumbled into myth, and myth into forgotten superstition. But my people kept certain records intact, hidden away, protected across generations, because the ending of that war shaped the very laws my ancestors swore to follow, laws that still govern how my empire conducts itself today, whether my court remembers their true origin or not. She paused, studying my face carefully, as though searching for some flicker of recognition that never came. The war ended, she continued, when 7 beings, representing 7 different peoples, forged an agreement so absolute that it became etched into the founding law of every civilization that survived the conflict. That agreement was sealed not with words alone but with 7 rings, crafted from a material no living scholar in my empire can fully explain, each one carrying a signature only its rightful bearer could ever produce. I stared at her, my mind struggling to connect what she was describing to the plain, unremarkable ring on my hand. "You are saying this ring is one of those 7, I said slowly. "I am saying," the Queen replied, "that the markings on that ring match records my empire has protected for longer than your species has walked upright on 2 legs. Whether you understand its meaning or not, human, you are currently wearing something that my entire civilization was built to respect above almost everything else, including the word of any monarch who has ever sat upon this throne." The chamber fell silent again. Beside me, Oliver had gone completely pale, and even Grace, normally so composed, looked as though she needed a moment to fully absorb what had just been said. I watched her fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the data slate she still held, the only outward sign that the ambassador who had faced down hostile committees and furious colonial governors without flinching was, for once, struggling to find her footing. "If that is true," Grace said carefully, "then why has no one from the Concord ever mentioned this to us before? Why would something this significant remain hidden from an entire species?" The Queen's expression darkened slightly, because very few outside my own court believed such rings still existed at all. They were considered lost, scattered across the galaxy after the fall of the Old Alliance, or destroyed entirely during the long centuries of conflict that followed. For one to appear now, worn casually by a member of the very species my ancestors once fought beside during that war, changes everything my people believed about your history and possibly about your future. I looked down at the ring, the same simple band I had worn every day for years without a second thought, remembering my grandmother's quiet insistence that I never explain where it came from, never let it out of my sight, never treat it as anything other than an ordinary family heirloom in front of strangers. She had known. Somehow she had always known exactly what this was, and had chosen, for reasons I could only guess at, to protect that knowledge rather than pass it fully to me, perhaps believing the burden was safer carried in silence than spoken aloud where the wrong ears might hear it. "Your Majesty," I said carefully, "if this ring truly means what you are describing, then I need you to explain exactly what happens next, because right now I do not understand what any of this means for the Dencora dispute, or for my delegation, or for my own safety standing in this room." The Queen studied me for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the mockery from earlier in the summit. Instead, it carried something closer to careful respect, mixed with an unmistakable trace of fear, the kind of fear that comes from realizing an old story you assumed was harmless legend has just walked into your throne room wearing an ordinary face. "It means," she said slowly, "that everything discussed in this chamber before this moment no longer applies. The negotiations we were conducting were built on the assumption that your species stood beneath mine in every meaningful way. That assumption has just been proven false in a manner my own laws cannot ignore, regardless of what I personally believe or wish were true." Chancellor Drassen, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward, his voice low and measured, the voice of a man who had spent decades choosing his words with extreme care before a throne that did not tolerate careless speech. "Your Majesty, if I may speak plainly, the ancient compact is explicit on matters such as this. A confirmed seal-bearer cannot be treated as a subordinate party in any formal negotiation. The laws governing succession, alliance, and territorial dispute all defer automatically to the authority the seal represents. "I am aware of the compact, Chancellor," the Queen said sharply, though there was no real anger behind the words, only tension, the sound of someone already exhausted by a conversation that had barely begun. "I am simply trying to determine how much of it still applies after 10,000 years, and how much has been forgotten or altered by lesser scholars who never expected to see it invoked again." I felt Grace's hand touch my arm lightly, a silent signal that she wanted a moment to speak privately, but there was no privacy to be had in this chamber, not with the Queen, the General, and the Chancellor all watching us closely, waiting to see how the newly discovered seal-bearer would respond to authority none of us had asked for. "Your Majesty," Grace said instead, choosing her words with obvious care. "Before we go any further, I think it would be wise for you to explain fully what this compact requires, and what it means for both our peoples going forward. My colleague did not come here today expecting to represent anything beyond a simple mining dispute. If circumstances have changed, we deserve to understand exactly how before any further decisions are made in this room." The Queen looked at Grace for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though accepting the fairness of the request, despite how uncomfortable it clearly made her to admit there was anything left for her to explain. "Very well," she said. "Sit, all of you. What I am about to explain will take some time, and I suspect none of us will look at this negotiation the same way once I am finished." We sat, gathered around the same table where moments earlier the Queen had mocked our species without hesitation, though now the atmosphere in the chamber had transformed entirely, charged with a tension none of us had walked in expecting, and centered entirely around a plain silver ring that I had worn every single day of my adult life, without ever understanding what it truly was. The Queen remained standing even after the rest of us had taken our seats, pacing slowly along the edge of the table as she gathered her thoughts, her earlier composure clearly still shaken by what had just been confirmed in front of her own advisors. 10,000 years ago," she began, "before my empire claimed a single star system beyond our homeworld, this region of the galaxy was consumed by what my ancestors called the Long Fracture. Dozens of civilizations fought across hundreds of systems, not for territory alone, but for control over technologies so dangerous that entire star clusters were rendered uninhabitable before the conflict finally burned itself out." She paused near the window, overlooking the dark expanse of space outside the flagship, her reflection faint against the glass, a small silhouette standing before an ocean of unfamiliar stars. My people were among the smaller powers involved, barely surviving the early years of that war. We would not exist today, not as an empire, not as a civilization capable of building ships like this one, if it were not for an alliance formed between 7 distinct peoples who chose to end the fracture rather than let it consume everything. And humanity was one of those 7 peoples, I said quietly, still struggling to accept the idea, the words feeling strange and enormous coming out of my own mouth. "Your species called itself something different then," the Queen replied. "Names change over 10,000 years. Empires rise and fall, entire civilizations forget their own origins, but the records my ancestors preserved describe a people who fought without hesitation, who negotiated without cruelty, and who ultimately proposed the very compact that ended the war entirely. Whether that people directly became what you now call humanity, or whether your species descended from scattered survivors of a larger civilization that once bore a different name, I cannot say with certainty. The compact itself does not concern origins. It concerns bloodlines and signatures, and the authority those signatures carry." Chancellor Drassen cleared his throat quietly. "Your Majesty, perhaps it would help if I explained the mechanics of the seal itself, since our guests clearly have no prior context, and every additional minute of confusion only makes this conversation more difficult for everyone involved." The Queen gestured for him to continue, clearly relieved to let someone else carry part of the explanation, and settled at last into a chair at the head of the table, close enough now that I could see the exhaustion behind her carefully composed expression. "The 7 rings," Drassen said, turning toward me directly, "were forged using a process no modern scholar fully understands. Each one bonds permanently to a single bloodline at the moment of its creation, and can only be worn without consequence by a direct descendant of that original bearer. Any other being attempting to wear one experiences immediate and severe physical rejection, something akin to an intense burning sensation that intensifies the longer contact continues. This property alone is why the rings were never simply stolen or seized by force during the centuries following the war. They are, quite literally, useless to anyone outside the correct bloodline. I have worn this every day since I was young," I said. "It never caused me any pain." "Because you are the rightful bearer," Drassen said simply. "The bloodline recognizes you." "But why would my grandmother never explain any of this to me?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice despite my efforts to stay calm. "If this ring truly carries this much significance, why let me wear it my entire life, believing it was nothing more than an old family trinket?" The Queen answered before Drassen could. "Because knowledge of the seals disappeared almost entirely after the war ended. My own empire nearly lost the records completely during a period of civil upheaval several thousand years ago. It is entirely possible your grandmother knew only fragments of the truth herself, passed down as instructions without full context, warnings inherited across countless generations without anyone remaining who could explain exactly why those warnings mattered." Before I could respond, one of the guards stationed near the sealed doors stepped forward without waiting to be addressed, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of a curved weapon at his side. He was younger than General Thorne, his armor less ornate, and his voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had spent his whole career trained to see threats before they fully formed. "Your Majesty, forgive me," he said, "but should we not consider the possibility that this is a deception? A forged ring, perhaps, or a relic stolen from some forgotten vault and passed down as a family trinket by beings who understood exactly what it could be used to claim?" The chamber went tense again, and I felt my pulse quicken. General Thorne turned toward the younger guard with a look sharp enough to cut metal. "The bloodline test cannot be forged, Captain. You know this. If the human were not a true bearer, the ring would have rejected his flesh the very first time he placed it on his hand as a child. There is no device known to any empire capable of faking that reaction convincingly enough to fool a direct inspection." "Then let us test it further," the captain pressed, clearly unwilling to back down easily, his eyes flicking toward me with open suspicion. "Have him remove it. Have someone else attempt to wear it in front of us all. If it truly bonds only to his bloodline, the proof will be immediate and undeniable." I felt a flash of alarm at the suggestion, though I tried to keep my expression steady. Grace's hand found my arm again, steadying, and I forced myself to breathe evenly. The Queen considered the captain's suggestion for a long moment, her eyes moving between me and the ring, before finally shaking her head. "No. If the reaction the Chancellor described is genuine, forcing it upon another being in this chamber risks serious harm, and I will not have blood spilled over a test whose outcome I already suspect I know. General Thorne's visual inspection, combined with the historical wear patterns and the metal signature, is sufficient confirmation for my purposes. The captain's caution is noted and appreciated, but this line of questioning ends here." The captain bowed stiffly and stepped back into position, though his eyes remained fixed on me with open distrust for several long seconds before he finally looked away. It was a small moment, but it reminded me that not everyone in this chamber would simply accept what had happened without resistance, and that whatever authority I now supposedly carried would not be handed to me without challenge, not from the Skarn court, and quite possibly not from anyone else once word of this began to spread. "Chancellor Drassen," Grace asked, once the tension had settled again, "what does the compact actually require in terms of practical consequence for our current negotiation? I want to understand precisely what changes, not simply that something has changed." The Queen exchanged a glance with Chancellor Drassen before answering herself. The compact establishes that any confirmed seal-bearer holds authority equal to that of a reigning monarch in matters of interstellar dispute. It further states that no ruling power bound by the original alliance may act with hostility toward a seal-bearer or their people without triggering consequences the compact itself describes, consequences my empire has never actually witnessed enforced, since no seal-bearer has appeared before my court in recorded history. Meaning, General Thorne added quietly, that the fleet deployment Her Majesty threatened earlier in this summit is no longer something she can pursue without violating one of the oldest and most sacred laws my empire has ever recognized, laws that predate my own family's claim to this throne by thousands of years. The room fell silent again as the full weight of that statement settled over everyone present. I looked at Grace, whose expression had shifted from careful diplomacy to something closer to cautious astonishment, and at Oliver, who still looked as though he could barely process what he was hearing, his hands gripping the edge of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. "So the Dencora dispute," I said slowly, trying to work through the implications myself, "is no longer just a mining conflict between two competing colonies." "No," the Queen said simply. "It has become something my empire cannot legally treat as an ordinary territorial disagreement, not while a confirmed seal-bearer stands within my own court, representing your species." "Your Majesty," Drassen added carefully, "I believe it is worth noting that the compact does not simply protect the seal-bearer's immediate safety. It grants standing authority to negotiate on behalf of an entire people, provided the seal-bearer chooses to exercise that authority. Whether your colleague understands the full extent of what that means yet, I cannot say, but the law itself does not require understanding, only bloodline confirmation, which General Thorne has already verified before witnesses." I felt the weight of every eye in the chamber turn toward me, and for the first time since stepping aboard this flagship, I understood that whatever happened next in this negotiation no longer depended entirely on Ambassador Whitfield's careful diplomatic strategy. It depended, at least in part, on decisions I would need to make myself, decisions I had never trained for, never expected to face, and barely understood the full consequences of. The captain near the door still watched me with narrowed eyes, and I understood that every choice I made from this moment forward would be judged not only by the Queen, but by an entire court waiting to see whether I deserved the authority that had just been placed, unasked, into my hands. "I need a moment," I said quietly, looking at Grace. "This is not something I can simply decide alone, sitting in a room I did not expect to hold this kind of authority in." The Queen studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression softened slightly, the fear from earlier replaced by something closer to grudging respect. "That caution is wise," she said. "A monarch who understands the weight of sudden power without hesitation is far more dangerous than one who pauses to consider it carefully. Perhaps your species has not forgotten everything that made your ancestors worthy of standing among the original 7 after all." "Your Majesty," Grace said, "if the compact truly grants my colleague this kind of authority, then I believe it is only fair that we request time to fully understand its terms before proceeding further with any formal negotiation. Rushing into decisions neither of us fully understands would serve no one well, including your own empire." The Queen considered this request for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Reasonable," she said. "I will have the full text of the ancient compact translated into your language and provided to your delegation immediately. We will reconvene once you have had sufficient time to review it, and once your colleague has decided how, or whether, to exercise the authority the seal grants." As the meeting adjourned and the guards escorted us toward the quarters prepared for our delegation, the captain who had questioned my legitimacy fell into step a short distance behind us, close enough that I could feel his presence the entire walk down the long corridor, though he said nothing further. I did not look back at him, but I did not forget him either. Oliver walked beside me in silence for a while, before finally speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you have any idea," he asked, "any idea at all, that ring was something like this?" None, I admitted. My grandmother never explained anything beyond those 3 warnings. I always assumed she was simply sentimental about an old piece of jewelry. Well, Oliver said, glancing over his shoulder at the captain still trailing several paces behind us. I think it is safe to say this negotiation just became a lot more complicated than anyone expected when we boarded this ship this morning. And I do not think that guard back there believes a word of what just happened in that chamber. He does not have to believe it, Grace said quietly, not turning around. The Queen already does. That is what matters right now. We reached the quarters assigned to our delegation a few minutes later, a suite of rooms far more comfortable than any of us had expected, given how coldly the summit had begun that morning. 2 guards took up position outside the door as it slid shut behind us, and through the thin wall, I heard the captain's low voice exchanging a few clipped words with them before his footsteps finally faded down the corridor. Oliver sank into the nearest chair the moment the door closed, letting out a long breath he seemed to have been holding for most of the walk. "I keep waiting to wake up," he said. "This morning, we were preparing talking points about mineral extraction quotas. Now apparently, you are some kind of ancient treaty holder, with authority over an entire empire's foreign policy." "I am not sure authority is the right word yet," I said, sitting down across from him, still turning the ring slowly on my finger, feeling its familiar weight, the same weight it had always carried, though it felt entirely different in my hand now than it had that morning. I do not even fully understand what I am supposed to do with it. Grace remained standing near the window, watching the swirl of a distant nebula outside the reinforced glass, her arms folded, her expression unreadable in the way it always became when she was working through several problems at once. "Whatever you decide to do," she said finally, "it needs to be carefully considered. The Queen backed down today because she believes the compact is real and binding. If we act carelessly or arrogantly, we risk confirming every fear these people clearly still carry about what happened the last time beings with this kind of authority walked among them." "You think there is history there," I said, "beyond just the war itself?" "I think," Grace said slowly, "that an empire does not build an entire legal system around fearing 7 rings, unless something about those rings once went very wrong. We are going to need to read that compact extremely carefully, every clause, every footnote, before you make a single decision that cannot be undone." A soft chime sounded near the door, and a data slate slid through a narrow slot beneath it, delivered by unseen hands on the other side. Grace crossed the room and retrieved it, her expression tightening slightly as she scanned the first few lines glowing on its surface. "The translated compact," she said. "All of it, apparently. Whoever prepared this worked quickly." She handed the slate to me, and I looked down at page after page of dense, formal language, older and stranger than anything I had studied during my years preparing for Skarn diplomacy. Somewhere in these pages was an explanation for everything my grandmother had never told me, an answer buried in ancient legal text written by beings who had ended a war I never knew humanity had fought, using words that would decide not only the outcome of the Dencora dispute, but quite possibly the future of my entire species among the stars. I read late into what passed for night aboard the flagship, the artificial lighting in our quarters dimmed to a soft amber glow, meant to mimic a planetary sunset none of us would ever see from this deep in space. Section after section of the compact unfolded before me, written in careful, formal language that had clearly been softened slightly for modern translation, but still carried the weight of something written by beings who understood exactly how fragile peace could be. Clause after clause outlined the responsibilities and protections granted to a confirmed seal-bearer, rights to demand fair negotiation, protections against hostile action, authority to speak on behalf of an entire people in matters the compact defined as significant to galactic stability. There were older sections too, portions of the text describing consequences for any power that broke the compact's terms, consequences so severe that entire paragraphs seemed to exist only to make certain no ruler would ever consider testing them. Oliver had fallen asleep in a chair near the window sometime after midnight, exhausted from the emotional weight of the day, and Grace had retreated to the adjoining room to rest as well, though I doubted she was actually sleeping any more than I was. I sat alone with the slate glowing softly in the dim light, turning the ring on my finger again and again as I read, trying to reconcile the plain, worn piece of silver I had known my entire life with the enormous, world-altering authority the text described. A quiet sound near the outer door pulled my attention away from the slate sometime near the middle of the night. At first I assumed it was simply one of the guards shifting position outside, but the sound came again, softer this time, deliberate, the careful movement of someone trying very hard not to be heard. I set the slate down slowly and rose from my chair, my heart beginning to pound in a way that had nothing to do with diplomatic tension and everything to do with a much older, simpler kind of fear. I crossed the room quietly and pressed my ear near the seam of the door, listening. Voices, low and urgent, speaking in the same rapid dialect I had caught fragments of earlier in the throne room. I recognized one voice almost immediately, the captain who had questioned my legitimacy in front of the Queen. "Cannot allow this to stand unchallenged," he was saying, his words clipped and tense. "If the compact is truly invoked, it changes everything my family has served to protect for 6 generations. I will not watch the throne bow to some accident of birth from a species that barely understands what it holds." A second voice answered, quieter, harder to make out, though I caught the shape of a warning in its tone rather than its exact words. I stepped back from the door, my pulse hammering, uncertain whether to wake Grace immediately or wait to see what, if anything, actually happened. Before I could decide, the door chime sounded, sharp and sudden in the quiet room, startling Oliver awake with a gasp. I hesitated only a moment before opening it, bracing myself for whatever stood on the other side. It was not the captain. General Thorne stood in the corridor instead, flanked by 2 of his own personal guard, his expression grim in the low light. Behind him, further down the corridor, I caught a glimpse of the captain being led away by a second pair of soldiers, his posture stiff with barely restrained anger. "Forgive the disturbance at this hour," General Thorne said, his voice low. "I wanted to inform you personally, rather than let rumor reach you first. Captain Voss was found attempting to access the security override for this section of the ship, without authorization. He has been relieved of duty pending review." "Was he coming here?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. The general's jaw tightened slightly. "I cannot say with certainty what his intentions were. He has served under my command for years, and until today I would have vouched for his discipline without hesitation. But the discovery of a seal-bearer challenges beliefs some of my people have held for their entire lives, beliefs about their own empire's supremacy, about the natural order of things. Not everyone accepts change gracefully, even when the law demands it. I felt it was important you understood the danger clearly, rather than assume every soul aboard this vessel shares Her Majesty's willingness to honor the compact." Grace had appeared in the doorway of the adjoining room by now, alert and fully composed despite the hour, and she stepped forward beside me. "General, are we to understand there is a genuine risk to my colleague's safety aboard this ship?" "There was," Thorne said simply. "I do not believe there remains one now. Additional guards loyal directly to the Crown will be posted outside your quarters for the remainder of your stay, and Captain Voss will face formal judgment under our oldest laws, the same laws that now recognize your colleague's authority. Whatever his personal beliefs, he broke protocol, and the Empire does not tolerate that lightly, regardless of the target." After the general departed, the corridor outside falling quiet once more beneath the watch of new, unfamiliar guards, none of us returned easily to rest. Oliver sat rigid in his chair for a long while, staring at the door as though expecting it to burst open again at any moment, and even Grace, who had faced down hostile committees without flinching more times than I could count, kept glancing toward the entrance with an alertness she rarely allowed herself to show. "You should try to sleep," Grace said to me eventually, though her own eyes remained fixed on the door. "Whatever decision you make tomorrow will matter more if you make it with a clear head." "I keep thinking about my grandmother," I admitted quietly. about how she carried this same weight, apparently, without ever once telling anyone what it truly meant. I always thought she was simply a private person. Now I wonder if she spent her entire life quietly afraid of exactly this. Someone finding out. Someone deciding the ring mattered enough to take by force. She protected it well enough to get it safely into your hands, Grace said. That is no small thing. Whatever fear she carried, she never let it stop her from doing what needed to be done. I did not sleep much that night, but by the time the artificial dawn brightened the quarters once more, I had finished reading the compact in its entirety, every clause, every footnote, exactly as Grace had insisted. And somewhere in those long hours of quiet reading, broken only by the tension of an attempted intrusion in the dark, I had finally reached a decision about what kind of seal-bearer I intended to be, and what I intended to ask of an empire that had spent 10,000 years both fearing and half forgetting the very thing I now carried on my hand. The following morning, we returned to the same chamber, though this time the atmosphere felt entirely different. Queen Valtharis was already present when we arrived, standing rather than seated on her throne, a subtle but significant shift in protocol that Grace immediately noted with a quiet glance in my direction. General Thorne stood near her, along with Chancellor Drassen, and I noticed the younger guard who had questioned me the day before was nowhere in sight. "I trust you slept well," the Queen said, though something in her tone suggested she already knew exactly how disturbed our night had actually been. "We managed," Grace said carefully. "General Thorne informed us of an incident. We appreciate the swift action taken to address it." The Queen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Captain Voss will answer for his actions, according to our oldest laws. I want to be clear that his beliefs do not represent the will of this court, nor my own judgment regarding the compact's authenticity. I simply ask that his actions not color your view of my empire as a whole." "They will not," I said, and meant it. "Every people carries those who resist change, Your Majesty. What matters most is how the ones in power respond when that resistance turns dangerous." Something in her expression shifted at that, a flicker of something that looked almost like respect, quickly hidden behind her usual careful composure. "Then let us proceed," she said. "I have reviewed the compact myself once more overnight, alongside my Chancellor. Tell me what you have decided, Seal-bearer." I drew a steadying breath, aware that every word I spoke next would be remembered, repeated, studied by advisors and historians long after this summit ended. "I have decided," I said, "that I do not want to use this authority to force your empire into submission. That is not what the compact was designed for, and it is not who my grandmother raised me to be. What I want is a fair resolution to the Dencora dispute, negotiated as equals, without the threat of your fleet hanging over either side." The Queen studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "That is a reasonable request, Seal-bearer. Perhaps more reasonable than many of my own advisors would have proposed in your position, given what you now hold over this court. I also want something else," I continued, drawing another steadying breath. "I want the Concord Council informed of what happened here today, not to threaten your empire, but so that other species understand humanity does not need to prove itself through conflict or intimidation to earn a place among the galaxy's respected powers. If this compact is real, and if it truly applies to my people, then the galaxy deserves to know the truth, rather than continue treating humanity as a curiosity that got lucky with a handful of old technologies." Chancellor Drassen exchanged a quiet glance with General Thorne, both of them clearly recognizing the significance of what I was proposing. Word of a confirmed seal-bearer, and the manner in which that seal-bearer had chosen to use their authority, would spread far beyond this single dispute, reaching every corner of the Concord within weeks, reshaping conversations in council chambers I had never even heard of before this summit began. "Are you certain," the Queen asked carefully, "that you understand what that kind of exposure will bring upon your people? Once this becomes known, every empire bound by the ancient compact will begin searching their own history for forgotten claims, forgotten bloodlines, forgotten debts owed to a species they assumed had nothing to offer beyond simple curiosity. Some of those empires will not react with the caution I have shown you today. I understand there is risk, I said, but I also understand that hiding this would only delay a reckoning that seems inevitable now that it has begun. Better my people face that reckoning honestly, with full knowledge of what they carry, than continue stumbling through the galaxy, unaware of the weight some of us have been quietly holding all along. The Queen was silent for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not fully read, somewhere between calculation and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. "Very well," she said finally. "The fleet deployment is cancelled. We will renegotiate the Dencora agreement under equal terms, with Concord oversight, exactly as your delegation originally proposed, before I chose to mock the offer instead of considering it properly. And I will personally ensure word of this summit reaches the full Concord Council through proper channels, rather than allow rumor and distortion to shape the story before truth has the chance." Grace stepped forward, placing the original data crystal back onto the table between us. The same crystal that had sat there ignored the day before, while the Queen dismissed our proposal without a second glance. "Then let us finish what we started yesterday, Your Majesty. Properly this time." Over the following hours, the negotiation proceeded in a manner entirely unlike the humiliating exchange from the day before. The Queen listened carefully to each point Grace raised, offering genuine counter-proposals rather than dismissive mockery, occasionally consulting quietly with Chancellor Drassen on points of Scarn law, while General Thorne remained nearby, watching the proceedings with an expression that had shifted, somewhere over the course of these 2 strange days, from wary suspicion into something closer to careful curiosity about the species he had spent his entire military career assuming posed no real threat and deserved no real consideration. By the time the sun equivalent of the Scarn homeworld had risen fully through the flagship's viewport, a formal agreement had been reached, one that split the Dencora resources fairly between both colonies, with independent Concord oversight exactly as originally requested, backed now not by the threat of a fleet, but by the quiet, undeniable weight of an ancient law neither side could pretend did not exist any longer. As the formal documents were signed and the small ceremonial seals affixed to both copies of the agreement, Queen Vale Tharis approached me privately, away from the attention of her advisors and my own delegation, waving off the guards who instinctively moved to follow her. "I owe your people an apology," she said quietly, her earlier arrogance entirely absent now, replaced by something far more measured and human, if that word could even apply to a being who had ruled for centuries longer than any person I had ever known. "I misjudged your species based on assumptions my empire has carried for a century, assumptions that clearly failed to account for what you actually are, or what you might yet become." "Apology accepted," I said. "Though I think the real lesson here is that neither of us fully understood the other before today, and perhaps that misunderstanding runs both directions more deeply than either of us realized when this summit began." She studied me for a moment longer, then asked the question I had been expecting since the moment this entire situation began. "Do you know," she asked, "whether there are other seal-bearers among your people, hidden away without knowledge of what they carry?" I thought about that question carefully before answering, because it was one I had asked myself repeatedly throughout the long night while reviewing the compact and lying awake afterward listening for footsteps outside the door. "I do not know," I admitted honestly. "My grandmother never mentioned other families, never mentioned anyone else carrying something similar. But if my family managed to protect this ring for countless generations without fully understanding its significance, it seems entirely possible other families did the same with different rings entirely, scattered across human space, tucked into jewelry boxes and family safes, worn to weddings and funerals without anyone suspecting what they truly held." The Queen's expression grew thoughtful. "If that is true, Seal-bearer, then your species may be sitting on far more authority within the ancient compact than either of us realized when this summit began. I suspect word of what happened here today will travel quickly, and other empires bound by the same ancient laws will likely begin searching for answers of their own, some out of genuine curiosity, others out of fear of what they might have already offended without knowing it. "What happens to Captain Voss?" I asked, before she could turn away, the question surfacing suddenly from somewhere in the back of my mind, where it had been sitting quietly since the night before. The Queen paused. "He will face judgment under laws older than either of us, laws that do not bend for rank or family history. Whatever sympathy I might feel for a soldier who believed he was protecting his empire, the law does not permit leniency for those who threaten a seal-bearer's safety, not even from within my own court. I would ask for mercy on his behalf," I said, surprising myself slightly with the words even as I spoke them, not because what he attempted was acceptable, but because fear does strange things to people who watch everything they believe in shift overnight. "I would rather your empire remember this compact as something that brought fairness, not simply punishment." The Queen looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable crossing her expression. "That mercy is yours to request, seal-bearer, though I make no promises regarding how my council will ultimately weigh it against tradition. I will say only that few beings in my position would think to extend such consideration towards someone who tried, however clumsily, to do them harm. My grandmother used to say that strength shown without cruelty is remembered longer than strength proven through force," I said quietly. "I think that lesson applies here as much as it did in that chamber yesterday." As our delegation prepared to depart the flagship several hours later, Grace walked beside me toward the transport shuttle, glancing at the ring still resting quietly on my hand, as it had for years without either of us ever suspecting what it truly represented. "You handled that better than I expected," she said. "Better than I think most people would have handled discovering something like this in the middle of a hostile negotiation, let alone with an attempted intrusion in the middle of the night, on top of everything else." "I just tried to think about what my grandmother would have wanted," I said. "She spent her entire life protecting something she barely understood, trusting that someday it would matter, trusting that whoever carried it after her would know what to do when the moment finally came. And did you know what to do?" Grace asked. I looked back through the shuttle window at the massive Skarn flagship shrinking behind us, thinking about everything that had happened over the past 2 days. The humiliation, the fear, the sudden weight of unexpected authority, and the quiet decision to use that authority not for personal advantage, but simply to secure something fair for the people I represented. "I think I am still learning," I said honestly, "but for the first time in my life, I finally understand why she told me never to explain where this ring came from. She was not protecting a secret for its own sake. She was protecting the chance for it to matter, someday, in exactly the moment it needed to." Oliver, sitting across from us in the small shuttle cabin, finally broke his long silence with a tired, disbelieving laugh. "I still cannot decide if this was the best or worst diplomatic posting of my entire career," he said. "I came here expecting mineral quotas and left having watched an empress kneel to the concept of ancient blood-right law in front of her entire court." "She did not exactly kneel," Grace pointed out, a rare small smile crossing her face. "Close enough," Oliver said. "Give it a few years, and the story will have her kneeling anyway. That is usually how these things go, once enough people have retold them." As our shuttle broke away from the Skarn flagship and turned toward the transport route back toward human space, a priority message arrived on Grace's terminal, flagged directly from Concord headquarters. She opened it, read it silently for a moment, then looked up at me with an expression somewhere between astonishment and quiet excitement. "It seems word travels even faster than the Queen predicted," she said. "3 separate Concord delegations have already requested emergency meetings, each one asking the exact same question." "What question?" I asked, though somehow I already suspected the answer. "They want to know," Grace said slowly, "whether humanity has any other families quietly holding on to old rings they assumed were nothing more than sentimental heirlooms." I felt a strange mixture of amusement and unease settle over me at the thought of Concord officials suddenly combing through centuries of human genealogical records, searching for other families who might unknowingly be carrying similar authority. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "Nothing yet," Grace said. "I thought that decision, like the last one, should probably start with you, given how well the first one turned out." I looked down at the ring on my hand one final time, thinking about my grandmother and her mother before her, and however many generations had carried this quiet, unremarkable-looking piece of metal across centuries without fully understanding what it truly represented, protecting it faithfully simply because they had been told it mattered. The shuttle continued its slow arc away from the Scarn system, the swirling violet nebula shrinking behind us, as human space grew steadily closer on the navigation display, and for the first time since stepping aboard that flagship, I allowed myself to simply sit quietly for a while, letting the events of the past 2 days settle into something I could actually carry forward, rather than simply survive. When we finally docked at the Concorde relay station orbiting the edge of human territory, a small crowd of officials had already gathered at the arrival gate, drawn by rumors that had clearly outpaced our own return. Among them stood a woman I recognized immediately, an elderly researcher from the Concorde Historical Archive who had spent years corresponding with Grace about obscure diplomatic precedents, someone I had met only briefly during training, but who now pushed her way to the front of the gathered crowd with unusual urgency. "Is it true," she asked, before we had even fully stepped off the ramp, that the seal responded to direct bloodline contact, exactly as the old records describe? "It is true," I said simply, and watched her expression shift from cautious hope into something close to wonder. "Then perhaps the old stories were never simply legend after all," she said quietly, almost to herself, before composing herself enough to formally introduce the delegation of officials waiting behind her, each one eager for a private audience, each one carrying their own questions about what this discovery might mean for treaties, for territorial claims, for 1,000 small diplomatic disputes scattered across human space that might suddenly find themselves reshaped by a plain silver ring nobody had thought twice about a few days earlier. Over the following weeks, exactly as Grace had predicted, the story spread far beyond the Concorde's official channels. Historians began combing through old family records searching for other rings, other seals, other quiet heirlooms passed down through generations with instructions nobody fully understood. 2 more were found within the first month alone, one belonging to a farming family who had kept it in a simple wooden box for 3 generations without ever suspecting its significance. Another discovered in a museum collection where it had sat mislabeled as an antique costume piece for decades. Each discovery sent fresh ripples through Concorde politics, each one forcing another handful of ancient empires to reconsider exactly how much respect they truly owed a species they had spent a century dismissing as fortunate but unremarkable. I returned to my ordinary life eventually, or as close to ordinary as anyone in my position could manage, though invitations to formal councils and historical committees continued arriving with a frequency I never fully grew comfortable with. I kept the ring exactly where it had always been, on my right hand, worn every single day, though now I understood precisely what it meant every time I felt its familiar weight against my skin. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I still thought about my grandmother, sitting at that worn wooden kitchen table, turning the ring slowly on her finger while she told stories that never quite added up. I thought about how carefully she had guarded a secret she likely never fully understood herself, trusting blindly that someday, somewhere, it would matter in exactly the way it finally had. I thought about all the other families out there across human space, quietly carrying similar burdens without knowing it, waiting for their own unexpected moment to arrive. And I understood, finally and completely, that the galaxy had made a very old, very simple mistake in dismissing humanity as young and unremarkable. We had simply forgotten, for a while, exactly how much history we were quietly still carrying, tucked away in ordinary places, waiting patiently for the right moment to be remembered. Not every reaction to the news was peaceful. 6 weeks after our return, Grace forwarded me an encrypted message that had arrived through unofficial Concorde back channels, originating from an empire far older and considerably less patient than the Skarn Dominion, a power called the Thren Assembly that had, according to the historians now poring over every surviving fragment of the ancient compact, once lost a significant territorial claim during the original Long Fracture negotiations. The message was brief, formally polite on its surface, but carrying an unmistakable edge beneath the careful diplomatic language, a request that the seal-bearer present himself personally before their council to verify certain disputed clauses regarding old border settlements nobody had thought about in millennia. "They are not asking," Grace said quietly, reading over my shoulder as I studied the message a second time. "Not really. This is a summons dressed up as an invitation. Do we have to respond?" Oliver asked, glancing between the two of us with visible concern. "We do not have to do anything," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I felt the same tight knot of unease settling in my chest that I had felt standing before Queen Vale Tharis for the first time. But ignoring an empire like that entirely seems unwise, given everything we have learned about how seriously these old laws are apparently still taken. Grace was quiet for a long moment, turning the problem over carefully in her mind, the way she always did before offering an opinion. "I think," she said finally, "we request a formal Concord mediator be present for any meeting, exactly as we should have insisted on from the very beginning with the Skarn. We do not walk into another throne room alone again, not knowing now what that first conversation nearly cost us in the middle of the night." It took 3 more months of careful diplomatic maneuvering, letters exchanged through Concord intermediaries, verification requests, cautious scheduling negotiations, before any actual meeting took place, and by the time it did, word of the ancient compact had spread widely enough that the Thren representatives arrived considerably more subdued than their first message had suggested they might be. Whatever leverage they had hoped to gain from cornering an unprepared, unaware seal-bearer had evaporated the moment humanity understood exactly what it was dealing with, and exactly how to protect itself while doing so. During that same stretch of months, I finally met the farming family whose ring had been discovered folded inside an old cedar chest passed down through 5 generations, stored alongside blankets and photographs nobody had looked through carefully in decades. Their daughter, a quiet young woman named Charlotte Ames, who worked the fields alongside her parents on a modest colony world at the edge of settled space, had no idea what she carried until Concord researchers arrived at her family's door asking careful, probing questions about an old ring her grandfather had once mentioned in passing during a holiday dinner years earlier. We spoke for hours the first time we met, comparing the strange, quiet instructions each of our families had passed down without explanation, noticing patterns neither of us had considered before. Her grandfather, like my grandmother, had never explained the ring's true nature, only insisted it never leave the family, never be sold, never be explained to strangers who asked too many questions. It was strange and comforting all at once, sitting across from someone else who understood exactly what it felt like to discover an ordinary inherited object was actually something the entire galaxy had spent millennia quietly fearing and forgetting in equal measure. "Do you think there are more of us?" Charlotte asked me during that first conversation, turning her own ring slowly between her fingers, the same way I so often did with mine, still out there somewhere, still completely unaware. "I think there almost certainly are," I said. "And I think sooner or later, every single one of them is going to have their own version of that moment I had in front of the Queen, some ordinary afternoon that suddenly becomes anything but ordinary. I hope when it happens," she said quietly, "they handle it as well as you apparently did." I laughed softly at that, thinking back to how uncertain and frightened I had actually felt standing in that chamber, how far from confident or prepared I had truly been, despite whatever calm I had managed to project outwardly. "I do not know how well I actually handled it," I admitted. "I just tried to remember that whoever trusted my family with this ring clearly believed we were capable of doing the right thing with it eventually. I figured the least I could do was try to live up to that trust, even while making it up as I went along." Charlotte smiled at that, and something about the shared understanding between us, Two ordinary people from ordinary families suddenly thrust into an ancient story neither of us had asked to be part of, made the whole strange situation feel a little less overwhelming, a little more manageable, knowing we were not facing it entirely alone. The Thren meeting, when it finally happened, went considerably better than the tense first exchange with Queen Vaeltharis had, largely because both sides now understood clearly what was at stake and approached the conversation with careful respect rather than assumption or mockery. Old border disputes were re-examined, ancient grievances quietly settled through proper concord channels rather than threats, and slowly, over the following year, humanity's position within the wider galactic community began shifting in ways nobody, least of all myself, could have predicted the morning I walked into that first hostile summit, expecting nothing more than a routine mining dispute. I still think, sometimes, about my grandmother's small kitchen, the smell of bread baking, the quiet insistence in her voice every time she reminded me never to lose the ring, never to sell it, never to explain where it came from. I understand now that she was not simply protecting an old family trinket. She was protecting a promise made 10,000 years before either of us was born, trusting that someday, in exactly the right moment, that promise would finally matter again. And somewhere out there across the vast, quiet distances of human space, I know there are still other rings waiting in cedar chests and jewelry boxes, other quiet warnings passed down without full explanation, other ordinary families unknowingly holding pieces of a story far larger than themselves. Sooner or later, each of them will have their own version of that moment, their own arrogant monarch or skeptical official suddenly falling silent, their own quiet, unremarkable object suddenly revealing exactly how much history it had been carrying all along. I only hope, when that moment finally arrives for each of them, they remember exactly what I try to remember every single day, turning the ring slowly on my finger, the way my grandmother once did before me, that the true weight of what we carry was never really about power at all. It was always about proving, quietly and patiently across generations, that trust placed carefully enough can outlast even the longest silence, and that sometimes the smallest, most ordinary-looking things carry the greatest promises of all.